And that's all I have to share for this evening. So I'd love to welcome our presenter, Pascal Sabino from Block Club, to talk about their work. So Pascal, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining. It's such an honor to be presenting some of my work here. I'm Pascal Sabino. I'm a journalist who I produced this project with Block Club Chicago, Injustice Watch and DataMade as part of the Circuit, which is a collaborative, data-driven, long-term investigative project that the goal of it is really to just use data to improve transparency and make it easier for the public to hold our justice system accountable in the many phases of the justice system. So both through the, whether it's policing or the court system. And so I wanted to present this, you may have read this story, but I wanted to present a few different pieces of it. So first, some of the background of how how we got from kind of a more surface level story into a much deeper and much more robust investigation. Then I want to present some of our findings from that investigation. And then finally, I'd love to talk a little bit about the process and about the data and how we did what we did to be able to figure out some of these, what I found to be really shocking findings for how Chicago police are doing traffic stops in their pursuit of making gun recoveries in the city. So just for some background, really from the phase of our investigation, what we're looking at is from 2015 to present. We're looking at from 2015 to present, and three main things were really changing over that period. First is traffic stops. So there's been a massive increase in just the volume of traffic stops since 2015. And this is according to the data that Chicago police is required by law, a law initially sponsored in the State House by former President Barack Obama. Then he was a state senator, but the Chicago police is required to report this data accurately by law, essentially as a way of allowing state watchdogs to examine racial bias and give the public some transparency on traffic stops, which are essentially the most frequent interaction that people would have with the police, right? And so this data that Chicago police reports, which we'll get into whether or not it's accurate. Spoiler alert, it's not accurate at all. But this data that Chicago police reports has shown that there's just been a massive increase in the volume of traffic stops. This is my assistant, Tito. He's helped me with a lot of the data analysis. He gets a little frightened, so he's barking right now. Tito, come on. So in 2015, there were about 85,000 traffic stops. That's increased to 600,000 by 2019. That volume tapered off a little bit, went down during the pandemic years, but is again on the rise, according to the CPD data. Over that same period of time, the city's use of stop and frisk fell off a cliff. It really declined very significantly. That's due to a 2015 lawsuit that the city settled with the American Civil Liberties Union, which they're actually the ones who put me on this story in the first place. They told me about the pattern that they were seeing with the huge increase in traffic stops at the same time that stop and frisk was declining. Essentially, the ACLU lawsuit was saying, hey, these foot stops are disproportionately targeting Black Chicagoans, overwhelmingly are happening on the South and West side, and they're pretextual. You're stopping people without an actual suspicion of a crime and violating people's civil and constitutional rights. And so the result of that, lawsuit was essentially, it didn't say that Chicago police can't, this was a settlement with the city. It didn't say that Chicago police can't do stop and frisk. It just said, hey, if you're going to stop somebody, you've got to fill out some paperwork to tell us why you're stopping them. So as soon as that requirement came into place, boom, foot stops declined massively from around 300,000 annually to about 60,000 annually. So, I mean, that's the power of having to fill out a piece of paper that you don't want to fill out. So the third thing at play here is gun possession. So obviously Chicago has a massive issue with gun violence, and the city's focus on how to address gun violence seems to have shifted. So over this period, there's been a strategic focus on gun possession. So this isn't necessarily there's been a shooting or there's somebody's been injured by a gun. It's gun possession, which is overwhelmingly, most frequently, according to prosecutors, these arrests are nonviolent crimes. And so the focus on this specific type of gun crime called UUW has increased tremendously in recent years, and the number of these specific kinds of arrests for illegal gun possession without an additional violent crime attached to it. Those kinds of arrests have tripled over that period of 2015 to present. So with these this increase in traffic stops, it obviously hasn't happened equally across the city. You can see here on a map that I made using that Chicago police data reported to state regulators. Whether or not you're going to get stopped by the police really just depends on what neighborhood you live in. So you can see there's a huge focus of these traffic stops on the west side and also a large focus on the south side. Not many stops are happening on the north side. I don't think this really surprises anybody here. Additionally, this data shows that Black drivers are stopped at 6 times the rate of white drivers. The data suggests that officers almost never are citing drivers for traffic stops. Folks in the public defender's office are saying, hey, if this was about traffic safety, then why aren't you citing people for traffic violations? And so there's this indication that, hey, maybe this isn't actually about traffic safety. Maybe you're stopping people and saying that they were speeding or saying that they had a busted taillight when it was never about the busted taillight. It was never about traffic safety in the first place. And the other issue I think with a map that looks like this is I would be shocked if only people in certain neighborhoods that are incidentally Black, if those are the only people who have busted taillights or the only people who speed or do rolling stop signs, but that's just me. One other takeaway from this data, Chicago police reported that they're actually not arresting very many people as a result of these stops. And so kind of the message that their report to watchdogs is, yeah, we're doing a lot of stops, but we're not actually we're not harassing people. We're not actually, it's not actually that burdensome on these communities, which we'll get more into that in a moment. So overall, from a high level, our findings by kind of further looking in from this more surface level report based on the data Chicago police themselves reported was that a lot of these statistics, they're just not accurate. And while Chicago police leadership has said, hey, there's no connection between our focus on gun possession and there's no connection between that and traffic stops. They've denied this repeatedly. There's a very clear connection. Like it's overwhelmingly obvious that that the reason why the traffic stops have increased is because they're using traffic stops as a way to search people, often without their consent, to find a weapon or to find some kind of contraband that will just boost their statistics and show that Chicago police are doing something. Like, hey, maybe the clearance rate for murders is really low, but hey, we got we found some guns. So another very clear finding for this investigation was that the traffic stops are increasing primarily in the places where stop and frisk was most heavily used in the past. And so when we are describing traffic stops as the new stop and frisk, it's it's almost a one-to-one transfer of, okay, we're not doing stop and frisk anymore, we're going to do more traffic stops. And this decrease in stop and frisk stops more than makes, or excuse me, the increase in traffic stops more than makes up for this increase, for this decrease in stop and frisk. So the net average is that there's more police contact, even though there's less stop and frisk, there's actually more police encounters. And I'm sure we've all been tuned into a lot of the stories we've been hearing around the country in these past couple of years about what any police encounter can turn into. And I think what's valuable, I think that just raises how important it is to kind of scrutinize, why are these stops happening, and is it worth it to invest in a strategy that's kind of stopping people for an ulterior motive that's not actually about the stop itself. So here's that data visualized for that discrepancy between how many stops Chicago police says they're doing and how many stops we were actually able to find using an alternative set of data from the OEMC, the Office of Emergency Management and Communications, which has a separate set of data that essentially was able to show us the same thing, which is these traffic stops. So there's hundreds of thousands more traffic stops than what they reported to state regulators. In some years, it's like 30% of the traffic stops that are actually happening, they're never actually documenting, which it's jarring to me, because if police are having contact with civilians, with people, but they're not reporting it, I think it's worrisome for a couple of reasons. First, like, we should know what the police are doing, right? And the police should know what the police are doing. How are they going to devise strategies from the top level if they don't actually know what officers on the ground are doing, because they're not actually documenting what they're supposed to be doing, right? And here we can see that trade-off between traffic stops and pedestrian stops. So steep drop in traffic stops shortly after that pedestrian stop shortly after the ACL lawsuit, and that drop in pedestrian stops is persistent. It's fluctuated, risen a slight bit in some years, but has stayed very low, whereas traffic stops jumped massively before tuckering down during the pandemic. But some of the more recent data that I've looked at has shown that traffic stops are, once again, very steeply on the rise. So some of our other findings that I think kind of really gets to the point of what we're looking at here, these traffic stops are actually an extremely inefficient strategy for finding guns. If that's what the traffic stops are about, if they are about guns, there's nothing that shows that it's actually a very good way of doing it. So we looked at the hit rates, so how many stops it takes to find one weapon year over year. So the most efficient year, the year that the police did the best, and mind you, there are years when their efficiency is half this or less than half this, but their most efficient year, it was 150 police traffic stops to find one gun, even though that's often much lower. I talked to a lot of experts, so criminologists, social scientists, who really look into stop and frisk and traffic stops and just gun strategies. They say that this is called a general deterrent strategy, and the crux of this is that it doesn't matter from the police perspective. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're not actually finding guns. What matters is that you make people really scared that at any time they can be harassed by the police, because everybody is in fear. And when I say everybody, I don't mean everybody in the city. I mean everybody in certain neighborhoods. Everybody is afraid that they could be harassed at any moment. The theory is that the likelihood of them carrying contraband is lower, but this only works if everybody has the fear. And so Professor Wes Gogan, who I talked to for this story, said being innocent, not carrying anything, just going about your business does not insulate you from being stopped. And so what I think is important here is that this is a weight that's borne by everybody, not just on people who might be carrying guns, which I'm not going to get into why somebody might be carrying a gun. I think that's a separate conversation. But the cost of this is borne upon everybody. Okay, here is some more of this data visualized. So this is the change in the number of stops, just when you visualize it from the kind of this transformation in the strategy of what's happened here. It is a little jarring, and those disparities, I think, are very, very, very clear. There's you can see on the map on the left in 2014, there's kind of an anomaly down there on the south side, that really dark black area. So that's just Lakeshore Drive. It seems like for whatever reason, Chicago police, they just code any stop that happens on Lakeshore Drive, they just code it to this one address. So it's all of the stops on Lakeshore Drive get put into that one police beat. And the way that we created these maps was we used every traffic stop has a police beat connected to it. And so we use that to just like map out all of the stops geographically, just to visualize it. Okay, so let's talk about how we kind of figured this out, because like Chicago police told us one thing and surprise, it just wasn't true. How do we use data to figure out that the data they gave us isn't actually as accurate as it seems? So like I mentioned before, data is redundant. Slightly different versions of the same data are kept by multiple agencies. So Chicago police, initially the data that I showed you at the beginning, we got that data from the Illinois Department of Transportation, because like I said, the law requires this state agency to kind of make this data public for watchdogs, and so we know what police agencies are doing. In order for the Department of Transportation to have that data, Chicago police has to collect it. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act to both the state and the city to get the same data. And it's just funny, it's the same data and it's still different for some reason. However, what's useful about that is because the data is a little bit different, sometimes it has different ways that you can look at it. For example, the data held by Chicago police includes slightly more information. So in addition to the demographic information that showed that Black drivers were 5 to 7 times more likely to be stopped by police than white drivers, it also included the police units that were doing the stops, which allows us to look at which kinds of for example, is it community units? Is it tactical units? Is it traffic police who are doing all of these traffic stops? It's not traffic police. And so because the data is redundant, you can kind of use these differences to figure out different ways to peer into what the data can tell you. One of the most important things for putting this story together was just like finding a roadmap to figure out what records exist and what data exists, because so much stuff, I think so much stuff is data that we can request, but we have to know it exists and we have to know how to request it. And so I like to think like, okay, anytime I'm filling out a form online, that's data. Like you fill out your name, you fill out your address, you fill out answers to these questions, that's all data and it's stored somewhere. So anytime any police officer is filling out a form, whether it's an arrest report, a ticket, anything, that's data. And there's a procedure for how they're going to do that. And finding out that procedure will allow you to figure out what data you can glean from those forms. So what I always do is I look at the police directives. So that means that if a police officer is doing what they're supposed to, we know every police officer always does exactly what they're supposed to do. Then if they follow these directives, then that data for every incident is going to be there. So this is the police directive that tells officers this is what you're supposed to do for radioing in to headquarters for these different scenarios. So what I did is I looked at these police directives for the radio communication system, which this is an interesting one because this isn't just for Chicago police. This directive essentially governs how individual officers connect with a separate department, which is OEMC, which they store their data differently, and they work with the police department, but they're not the same as the police department. So Here's a separate portion of that directive, and let's look through this. It says, when making a vehicle stop, officers should inform the dispatchers of the following: reason for the stop, location of the stop, etc. So this means that there is data that every officer does every time they do a traffic stop that is recorded in the computer-aided dispatch system that tells all of this information. So what we did for this story is we, instead of asking Chicago police, which we knew their data was wrong, we asked OEMC for their data from their computer-assisted dispatch system, which has a unique record for every time officers pull somebody over, every time they do it, even just for their sake, for their own protection. If you're pulling over a driver, you're going to radio into headquarters for your own safety so that they know where you're doing. And there's a unique record for every single traffic stop. And we were able to rigorously make sure, okay, every one of these is a different traffic stop. And we fact checked to make sure that we weren't kind of blurring the data at all. And using that, we found out there were just so many more traffic stops than what Chicago police was reporting. A huge challenge after we found this way of more robustly looking at the number of traffic stops was, how do we figure out how many gun arrests are happening from these traffic stops? Because we can't figure out the hit rate. We can't figure out how efficient this strategy is of using we can't figure out how efficient this strategy of using traffic stops to find guns is if we don't know how many guns they're actually finding, right? So we tried to tackle this in a few different ways. Some were more fruitful than others. One way we used was we just did a FOIA request for all gun arrests, or like a sample size of gun arrests, and we got the arrest reports. We got this because first we essentially got the aggregate data that had a different row of data for each traffic stop. We got all of the unique identifying numbers for each arrest. We used those unique identifying numbers to file a FOIA request to Chicago police for the full report. So rather than just the aggregated data that's like, okay, number, violation, date, time, that kind of stuff, we got the full report, which just has so much more robust information, which is really good for both storytelling and just for getting more perspective on how we can look at these stops. And so the first thing we did was we looked at the arrest reports, and we got a sample first of, I think, 50, then 100, then 200. And we just read through all of these arrest reports. And we said, okay, we have a sample of 100 arrest reports. Reading through the narratives, it looks like 50%, 60%, whatever, this amount of the gun arrests specifically coded for felony gun possession without a violent crime attached to it. This proportion of these gun arrests were traffic stops. Now, obviously, there's like thousands and thousands of these arrests over the years, so it was impossible to do all of those because we're a really small team. So we kind of tried to use a sample and then extrapolated by saying, okay, the sample of 100 arrests and X% of them are traffic stops. This gives us kind of an estimate. That's not what we ended up using in the story. So our second way at taking a crack at it, you can see it on this sample of the arrest report. By looking at all of these arrest reports, we figured, okay, there's a section here that shows the arrestee vehicle. So we filed a separate FOIA request for the aggregate data, so just the rows of every traffic stop, or excuse me, every gun arrest. And we specifically requested, hey, can you tell us the vehicle information? So the year of the vehicle, the type of vehicle, the car, the color, etc. And so that way we got a different way of looking at it by saying, okay, about 70% of this aggregate data on gun possession arrests, about 70% of them do have a vehicle information entered into them. So 70% of gun arrests are associated with somebody who was in a car at the time. The question there is, are they driving? Are they parked? Were they just hanging out outside of their car? So while we weren't able to confirm that means 70% of gun arrests are from traffic stops, that does get us a little bit closer. And then we can kind of use that sample process to see, okay, a large portion of these gun arrests where the person who's arrested was in a vehicle at the time, a large proportion of those were traffic stops. So we did one more thing that I think was the best way for us doing that. So back to that, the best way for us to figure out how many came from traffic stops. So going back to that, that directive that I showed you guys before, the OEMC directive specifies that the dispatcher will issue an RD number. So an RD number is essentially connecting, an RD number is anytime an officer makes an arrest, that arrest is, or when that person is booked, each arrest has kind of a unique RD number. And so what we did was we tried to see if we can connect all of the RD numbers for gun arrests, all gun possession arrest RD numbers. And we tried to see if we can connect that to the RD numbers in the OEMC data specifically coded for traffic stops. So you can see here, this third column from the left in this data, it says TS, that's TS for traffic stop. So yeah, TS for traffic stops. So all of these are for traffic stops. And we tried to connect those RD numbers, and that was one way that helped us a lot, but that's not what we ended up using in the end for this. So if you see the next column over, the fourth column from the right, it says final disposition. So anytime somebody is arrested, each arrest has a disposition code. And so what we did was we figured out which disposition code is for a variety of gun possession offenses. And we tried to figure out if we could connect the disposition codes to this OEMC data, and that worked, and it worked really, really well. And so we were able to identify how many, just by doing a count of all of the unique traffic stops that had a disposition code that indicated that it was a nonviolent gun possession arrest. We were able to find out how many traffic stops ultimately led to a gun possession arrest, which gave us an indication of the hit rate. How effective are these traffic stops as a strategy? And it took us so long to figure out that this is the best way to do it. But like I said before, having a roadmap and having a way of looking at what data is stored where made it so much easier for us to do this. Okay, a couple more things before we open up for a Q&A. So sourcing, every data point is a story. I think often I think this is a big moral of the story for this. You see data and you want to take it for what it is, but you've got to remember that anytime you see like a row of data, each data point on that row, there's so much more going into it. Like it's a cross section of a million different stories. And so, for example, on this here, you might not, you can't tell what's happening. You can look at the unit list, which will tell you where it happened. So this one that says 1111, I just know that because it starts with 11, that means it's in the Harrison district on the west side in Garfield Park, and it was the police beat in office, the officers assigned to police beat 11 who did the arrest, right? Or who did the traffic stop. But if you find a way, for example, through those RD numbers that I mentioned earlier, you can use that to connect to, for every one of these arrests, you can connect to an arrest report to see, okay, this wasn't just a traffic stop. There was something more that was happening here. So let's look at this arrest report for, this isn't that 1111 one, that was just an example, but we found it that way, through looking at those numbers and just looking through a lot of arrest reports to get a more robust telling of the story. So just looking at the very top of this arrest report, it says offender has a valid FOID card but does not have a valid CCL. So if you guys don't know, there are two types of gun licenses in the state of Illinois. So there's a FOID card, which gives you the right to have a gun. That does not mean you can carry it anywhere. You have the right to have a gun in your house. You cannot have that gun in your car unless it's locked in a lockbox and like out of arm's reach, and you're like going to the gun range or something. There's just stipulations to where you can have that gun. And then a CCL, a concealed carry license, which means that you can have that gun on your person. So this is interesting, right? Before, this was just a data point that, okay, somebody got arrested. But you look at the arrest report and it's a more interesting scenario, right? This person, they have a license to have that gun. And so the narrative of, oh, this is a bad person who was like riding down the street, shooting at people, it changes a little bit when you think, oh, they actually like, they had a license. Reading through the narrative, I actually talked to this person. He was actually coming from the gun range. He says he was coming from the gun range when he was pulled over by the police here. And it just gives you a lot more context than what the data point itself would have told you. So obviously this arrest report says something very different than what the person who was arrested might have said, but I will say this person beat their case. So I think they were in court for about a year and a half. Their argument was, my gun was in a lockbox because I was coming from the gun range. It was not in arm's reach, and the gun was unloaded. And this arrest report actually confirms, okay, the gun was unloaded. I believe the arrest report says it was in the back seat, but essentially the charge here is that the charge here on this arrest report is that, okay, this person had a right to have a gun, but the gun was stored improperly. Which is, again, it just tells a very different story from just illegal gun possession or like unauthorized use of a weapon, which is the technical charge. Okay, so experts and stakeholders, when we're talking about sourcing, like who knows a lot about these issues that we're talking about. So I talked to a lot of academics, so people who are using the scientific process really to kind of investigate what's going on with the violence in Chicago and policing. And they were really, really helpful because they kind of know the nuts and bolts of what's going on, not just from a scientific perspective, but almost kind of like there's like a personality, there's like a social element to policing because every time there's new police leadership, they kind of want to have almost like a glamour project, like, oh, we're creating this new police unit, we're taking this new direction, because like police leadership is a political position functionally. They're a political position that works in collaboration with the mayor. And so you want to have something to your name that shows that you're doing good work. And so I think a lot of times the experts have really good perspective from one administration to the other, or one police superintendent to the other. They kind of know like what's going on inside these offices and what they're motivated by. The last thing I'll talk about on sourcing, and I think before the Q&A, is police sources. Being able to talk to police was really, really, really helpful for putting this story together. One of the most helpful things that I learned talking to former police superintendents and former district commanders within Chicago police, and I'll say it's a lot easier to talk to a police source if they're retired now, because they have a little bit less to lose, and they really believe in improving the system. So I think they're open to talking about the places where they think went well and the places where they think did not go well. But that's a sidebar. The one of the most useful things that I learned from talking to retired police commanders and chiefs was that there are different perspectives to how this shift in strategy happens, because Chicago police is not an institution where the person at the top can snap their fingers and then everybody on the bottom will just start complying. There's a lot of difficulties with, for example, like filling out paperwork and getting people to fill out the paperwork that you want to fill out. And so some of the police commanders said, this is something that happened from the bottom up. There's pressure on individual officers to like boost their numbers. And nobody was saying, according to this police commander, nobody was saying, get your numbers up, or excuse me, nobody was saying do more traffic stops, but they were saying, you better get some more guns off the street, or you better make some more of this kind of arrests. And so it's kind of like a game of they said it's like a game of telephone where you tell one person one thing, they tell another person another thing, and then the material that manifests on the ground is not necessarily what's being said at the top. Now, I talked to other commanders who said, yeah, this was something that happened from the top. Like, we know that if we cast this wide net, this is the best way to boost this specific kind of numbers. And so we were saying boost traffic stops. One other police commander who I spoke to told me something really interesting. He said that the reason why there was a lot more focus on traffic stops was because that's how the nature of crime had shifted. He told me that there was a lot more crime happening. And I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard of some of the shootings happening on the highways and stuff, but he said like a lot more crimes were happening in cars. Whereas in the 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't that much like drive-bys or like highway shootings and things like that. His perspective as somebody who was kind of engaged strategically in thinking about the structure of how violent crime happened. He said that it was a result of this like breakdown in gang leadership structures, which I think was a really big focus of Chicago police in the early 2000s. Arresting gang leadership led to kind of like fracturing of gangs. So there's not really like big gangs with lots of territory now. It's like really small crews with 1 or 2 blocks of their territory. And so rather than territorial disputes, he said that there's people just driving from one neighborhood to another because they don't like have their own territory where they can like claim. And so because the nature of conflict had separated because of this fractionalization of gang structures, it just lended itself to more crimes happening that are involving vehicles, which doesn't necessarily change the nature of the story we're trying to tell, but it's, I think, really valuable context because I guess this is the final thing I say. We know what's happening. Like, we can see it, we can experience it. Like me as somebody who's Black, like it's something I think about all the time. I go outside or I go driving and I can just be pulled over for no reason. Like, we know this is happening. Nobody needs to tell us. So the question is like, why is it happening? And we can look at the data to figure out why it's happening, and that can tell us so much. But the reasons, it doesn't matter if I agree with the reasons, like why police might have this approach, but having the reasons is really helpful for being able to kind of investigate, like, okay, is this an effective strategy for doing what you say you're doing? Is this, are there ramifications to this strategy? Is disenfranchising an entire community to have these, like, whatever public safety benefits you might gain from this strategy? It is disillusioning a community from partnering with the police and the goal of improving public safety. Do these things work together? Like, if people don't believe in the police, can police do their jobs because of this strategy? So I think it's, again, really important to talk to the sources and to earnestly invest in understanding those perspectives in your even as you investigate, like, is this strategy ridiculous? Okay, and I'll leave it at that. And so I think we can shift to a Q&A. If you guys have some questions for me, I'm wide open.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. Really enjoyed this. We definitely do have some questions from our audience. So I'll just kind of get started. Sorry, pulling up the Q&A doc. All right. The first one from our audience today, I'll ask, are your FOIA requests public or shareable so we can learn from your strategy?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I have an exciting answer for you. So every FOIA request ever made is always public. And one thing that is actually super helpful for me as a journalist, but I think also really empowering just as people, we can always, it's kind of like Inception, I guess. You can FOIA the FOIA logs. So you can ask Chicago police to give you a log of every FOIA with the word traffic stop in it. Or I think there's actually a portion on their webpage that has a list of past FOIAs. it typically doesn't include the text itself, but it will say who requested it and like the topic of the FOIA, but it's different agency to agency. To be honest, most agencies have not updated those in a long time. Like they'll update them quarterly or something. But sometimes, sometimes they are really helpful. But yeah, you can FOIA past FOIA requests. And I'll tell you right now, journalists are just super excited about FOIA and will always be happy to either like individually help you file your FOIA um, or otherwise share the text of the FOIA that they used. And advice on filing a FOIA, if you reference, for example, the police directive that indicates how the data should be stored, that gives them very little wiggle room to say, we don't have this data, or like, this is unduly burdensome. It's like, we know you have this. It's written right here. We know you have it. We know where it's stored. It just makes it so much easier and quicker, and it shows them that you're talking business, and then they're much more likely to take you seriously also.
Awesome. Another audience question: is there any data on licensed gun owners encountered by CPD?
So I'm giggling because I was asking some folks at the sheriff's office this just like 2 days ago, because I would love to be able to get my hands on that data. So that data is not publicly available and you cannot FOIA it. That's not held by Chicago police. That would be held by, or I suppose just like a gun registry, that would be held by the Illinois State Police. That's not, they are really protective of that kind of list because one of the allegedly, I don't know, this isn't me like with some agenda or something, but like allegedly, the reason what I hear is that they don't want to share this because apparently there's a fear that if people know who has a gun license, it would be really easy for those guns to get stolen. And obviously there's a massive black market for guns. And so there's a fear that if you have documented people who have encountered people who have like a gun license, or people who have a gun license and have been pulled over, it would just make it really easy for somebody to like break into their home and steal their weapon to like sell on the black market. Am I answering that question correctly? Is that the correct question?
I think so. The way that I read it, it was just like for folks who were getting traffic stops, like the split between like, okay, you had a gun and you were stopped, but you're licensed, so you're fine. You know what I mean? That's how I read the question.
Oh yeah. No, I don't think that's necessarily documented. If of just like an ordinary traffic stop, pulled over, they have a gun, but it's not, there's no arrest involved. I don't think that's something that's documented.
Another audience question. Did you look at other outcomes from traffic stops? For example, other types of arrests or injuries?
I didn't look at injuries. Although one thing that I did look into, I'm a huge fan of the Invisible Institute. They're so amazing.
Yeah.
They have one of my favorite journalists in the city, Trina Reynolds, was working on a project to compile police complaint records. So for whatever reason, I think it's just really, there's not a lot of transparency when somebody files a complaint against a police officer for a misconduct incident. And so the Invisible Institute did a really amazing project called, I think, the Citizens Police Data Project, which makes public all kinds of complaint records, lawsuits, things like that. And so I did, as I was looking at this, I did look into, I didn't ultimately use a ton of it, but I looked into that to see, just to kind of get a picture of like, okay, how often are traffic stops leading to somebody's like rights being violated in a way where, or like what these violations look like. Are people getting injured? Are people, getting, I don't want to think too much about it right now because yeah. But highly recommend, if that's something that you're curious about, you can look into that. The Illinois Department of Transportation data that we were initially looking kind of at the surface level does include other types of things that are happening. So it includes like drug contraband and things like that. And looking year over year, we looked a little bit at that, but that wasn't really the focus of this investigation. Looking year over year, I mean, that was like a big that was like a big thing. I mean, similarly, if officers are being told like you need to boost your numbers, weed was illegal until a couple of years ago, you know, like and I looked at that. I haven't written a story about that, but like, look, maybe I will. It was just like the number of traffic stops um where there was a weed arrest
Mm.
disappeared as soon as weed was legalized. But it was it was there before. And it was underreported, you know, like if everything we're talking about here is underreported, like of course these weed arrests are being underreported too. But that wasn't the focus of our investigation. But if you want to check it out, just look at the Illinois traffic stop study. If you just Google it, I think it'll take you to the webpage. And that report should have a summary of the various types of like arrests or citations that are given, and some of them are for things besides weapons. But I mean, since the legalization of weed, and just like also this like shift in strategy and focus on gun possession as opposed to like violent crime, um that's really been the thing that we're looking at.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more audience question. How can OEMC data be utilized as a way of honest brokering the current policing approach?
This is kind
Kind of a heavy one for you. Clearly, that's an easy, 2-sentence answer, but
okay.
curious.
So I mean, look, the OEMC data is vast, and it's these systems collect way more data than we think it does. And so I'll give you some thoughts, and some of these are like not my thoughts, these are thoughts that come from other people as well. So a researcher based in California recently reached out to me and was kind of like, hey, I'm interested in looking at this OEMC data and how we can look at how this police activity is related to ShotSpotter. So we know ShotSpotter screwed up. We know ShotSpotter messes up all the time. And so his interest was, okay, can the OEMC data tell us how ShotSpotter guides the direction of policing resources in general, which I think is really interesting. And so just the idea of like connecting this OEMC data, because at the end of the day, the OEMC data, anytime the police radio in, that's data that is in that OEMC system. Like there are like terabytes of that data, which is why I just asked for traffic stop data, but I mean, everything police do is in that OEMC data. Another thought on that is Chicago police recently, they lost a lawsuit or settled a lawsuit with the Central Austin Neighborhood Association, who fought a 10-year legal battle, okay, to get Chicago police to make public OEMC data on how long it takes for them to respond to a 911 call. Because they were saying, hey, we are calling 911 saying there's a shooter, somebody's breaking into my house, like I got hit by a car, whatever. And then it takes the police 2 days to respond, right? And so without that data being available, they had no, I mean, like, again, me as a Black person, I know what's going on here. You don't need to tell me, but having the data to be able to say, look, I have your receipts. I know where you were. I know you were not here is really, really helpful. And so I think just last year that data became available, and the city had a deadline to when they were supposed to release that data. They missed the deadline, but that data is available now. And now the fact that lawsuit was settled means that we're empowered to ask for that, and we're empowered to ask for kind of more intricacies with that. So with that, oh my gosh, you asked this at the end. I could keep talking about this and talking about it. but like, yeah, I mean, just how are our police resources allocated? Are police doing what they say they're doing? When you call 911, are they going to show up? And the last thing I'll talk about, which like there's a forthcoming story on this, so don't steal my
Little
headline.
sneak peek. I love it. That's great.
is which officers are doing what. So I find really interesting Mayor Lightfoot and the former police superintendent um created these like community policing units, right? It sounds so beautiful, right? Community police, it's police for the community. They help old ladies cross the street. You have a cat stuck in the tree, they help you get the cat down. Like they walk the kids to school and stuff like that. Is that what they're actually doing though? And so using this OEMC data, like I showed you guys before, you can see the specific codes for which police unit is doing what. And so there are police units that are assigned, like for example, the gang unit, there's the drug unit, there's the traffic unit. Are these police units doing what what we think they're doing? The answer is absolutely not. They're doing what, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a police officer. I don't know what their like internal motivations and strategies are. Again, really important to talk to police leadership and people on the inside about this. But the like I said, there's a lot of like politics going on and between the mayor's office and the police department, and like their motivations are not necessarily what we think they are. And so because they say this unit is for serving the community, it doesn't mean that they're doing what we think they're doing. Just because they're named something really cute and flashy doesn't mean that that's their business. And so I think the OEMC data can also be a really helpful way of thinking about that.
Wow, this has been really awesome. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. So I really thank you, Pascal. That was a really fantastic presentation. So for our listeners tonight, remember that immediately after this, we actually have the post-presentation Zoom call, where that's where you want to hop on if you want to be a part of any breakout groups, figure out what breakout groups are or what projects are going on right now. So please join there. And if, yeah, I think that's all I have. So there's one thing I have to do. Pascal, you can join me if you want, but I have to say, go forth and hack to everyone listening. All right, so I'll count down. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Go forth and hack. Good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.